presentation.
Welcome all to tonight's Scientists and Engineers for America conference call entitled Unlocking the Genome, the Future and Ethics of Genetic Testing. My name is Kathy Brentis, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pennsylvania. I study the mechanisms by which genetic material is passed down to the next generation in cells called gametes. This spring, along with fellow biologist Christopher Mazzocchi, I have been co-leading a group of SEA interns to investigate the policy of genetic testing and privacy. For more information about this virtual internship program, please feel free to contact either me or Program Director Brielle Welser after tonight's seminar for more information. Tonight, I am pleased to introduce our speaker on this topic, Dr. Sherry Bale. Dr. Bale, a board-certified PhD medical geneticist, is currently the president and clinical director of the company GeneDx. GeneDx specializes in genetic testing for rare hereditary disorders, primarily via DNA sequencing technologies. She has over 30 years of experience in genetic research, including positions at the National Institutes of Health. Her work has been published in hundreds of sources, including work on the heredity of skin disorders. We are excited to hear Dr. Bale's thoughts on some of the topics that have been prominent in the news headlines, including the future of genetic testing and the ethics of patenting genes. Now, before I get started, I'm going to give just a brief introduction of the topic, and then we're going to turn things over to Dr. Bale for a brief intro from her as well, and then on to our feature presentation, the question and answer session. So for my brief intro, for those of you who have a friend or a relative with a baby, you may well have said, "Oh, she gets her eyes from her mom," or "she gets her smile from her dad." The idea that traits can be inherited from our parents is not a new one, and in the approximately 150 years since a German monk named Mendel characterized the heredity of pea plants, we have come a long way. That's included elucidating the nature of a gene, the role of DNA in heredity, the structure of DNA, the way DNA acts as the code for cell proteins, and the way that changes in the DNA sequence of a gene, or the genotype, lead to physical manifestations, or the phenotype. In 2003, the human genome sequence, or the sequence of the billions of components that make up the DNA in a human cell, was completed. Today, certain changes in our genome can be associated with an increased risk of disease. In some cases, a genetic change is like that seen in the neurological disease Huntington's disease. Those that possess this change will, unfortunately, certainly develop the disease later in life. Some changes lead to a highly increased risk of certain diseases. For example, certain changes in the BRCA genes lead to a very high risk of breast or ovarian cancers. Other changes are more difficult to know what to do with. For example, they lead to slightly increased risk of certain diseases, but the other genes that we carry, as well as the environment, influence the actual phenotype that we develop. We are more than just the sum of our parts. The environment has a strong role to play in how we develop from a fertilized cell with a complete set of genetic information to an adult. Now, as technologies for the sequencing, or in other words, the reading out of our genetic information, become faster and cheaper, the ability to access our own genetic information will become more and more accessible. Indeed, genetic testing is not simply available as a medical test focusing on connecting symptoms with a genetic change or tracing a family history of a disease-causing mutation. There are numerous companies that sell direct-to-consumer testing kits, offering possible insights on everything from how well your body breaks down caffeine to where your ancestors might come from. But with these more readily accessible technologies come the concomitant ethical, regulatory, and other implications, challenges, and questions. On a personal level, how should you decide to get tested? And would you want to know if you carried the genetic changes that put you at high risk for an incurable disease later in life? How should you interpret genetic information that is less cut and dry? For example, genetic changes that lead to slightly increased risk of certain diseases. Turning to issues of privacy, how can we maintain our personal privacy as we move into an era of increased genetic testing? For example, what if your boss fired you because your DNA test indicated a high risk of developing a debilitating condition later in life? Concerns about the use of genetic information to deny people health insurance or to make employment decisions, and actual cases of these practices, led to the passage of GINA, or the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act of 2008. GINA prohibits this type of health insurance and employment discrimination based on your genetic information. But genetic privacy concerns still remain. One that has been in the news focuses on the use of DNA evidence in criminal cases. Whose genetic information should be in the searchable databases when forensic scientists attempt to link crime scene DNA to an individual? And how should these databases be searched? For example, is it okay to look for partial matches to family members in an attempt to identify a suspect? And, along another vein, how can we ensure that genetic information from medical and scientific studies is being used properly? All of these questions have been topics our genetic privacy virtual interns have been discussing this semester. On a regulatory level, how should direct-to-consumer testing kits be regulated? How can quality and correct interpretation be ensured? And what, if any, counseling to help with the interpretation of results should be required? Should it be legal to patent a gene? How do we strike a balance between encouraging companies to develop new testing and screening technologies and providing patients and others with affordable and accessible testing? How do these patents impact genetic research? One case that has been in the news recently has been the ACLU's lawsuit against Myriad, the company holding the patent on the BRCA genes. As mentioned, changes in these genes are implicated in some breast and ovarian cancers, and this suit has stemmed by the protest by some that the genetic tests are not affordable as a result. How will genetic testing affect healthcare in America? Could it widen the disparity in care between rich and poor? And finally, how will new information about DNA impact discussions about topics like race in America? As you can see, there is a lot to talk about. If you would like an overview of genetic testing, I recommend some of the readings sent out in this week's email, including the primer on genetic testing provided by the National Institutes of Health. But now, I would like to turn it over to Sherry, who will help us consider some of the topics I have just described, with a focus on the present and future of genetic testing and the ethics of issues like the patenting of gene information.